Thank you, Francisca.
Buenos días, good morning to everyone. Good afternoon to Nicolas, our distinguished guest today. This seminar will be in English, so let me introduce myself. I'm Harold Bayer, the president of the Universidad Ibáñez. Let me welcome you to this seminar organized by the Centro de Competencia. The seminar is called Big Tech and Free Competition. We have a superb panel today. Felipe will introduce them in a couple of minutes, so we're very grateful for their important involvement in this activity. So let me thank you, Nicolas, Daniela, and Alex for being with us today. Professor Petit, our speaker today, has written a very important book. It's called Big Tech and the Digital Economy, the Oligopoly Scenario. Yeah, I have to get accustomed to this new word, so I have to do it very slowly. To have the possibility of having a conversation about it is a wonderful opportunity for us. In this study, Professor Petit introduced a new and original theory to understand the framework within which competition takes place between large tech companies. That's the interesting aspect of the book. The big tech companies look like monopolies, but several of their behavior are far from the behavior expected for this type of companies. Understanding this phenomenon is what interests our international guest. His approach is that these companies can be simultaneously being monopolist and competitive companies. The competition they face is a form of pressure. It originates from companies that are outside the markets that they serve directly. This is stated in the page 33 of his book. His research to support this assertion relies heavily on non-traditional sources of analysis, such as the 10K reports that companies must file to the Securities and Exchange Commission, along with the studies that financial analysts do about these reports. The evidence from this analysis suggests that these companies, while having a structural position resembling a monopoly in their original market, behave in these markets and in others as competitive oligopolies. This is the key insight of the book, I think. The competition of the big techs would be then what he called a oligopoly, in which these giants would compete with each other or with other companies known or even unknown to them. Hence, a oligopoly describes the situation of a multi-product firm that holds a monopoly position in a market and at the same time takes competitive pressure from oligopolistic interaction in other markets. That's the idea behind the word. Of course, there are a few of them. It could be speculated that these companies would seek agreements to protect their position and minimize competition. Our guest finds no evidence to support this behavior. The idea that competition can take the form of a competitive pressure opens up a new avenue for antitrust authorities to act. Their focus should be to maintain that pressure even in the absence of competitive rivalry, rather than trying to regulate or put a brake to the development of these companies. The hypothesis is that as long as this pressure is maintained, the benefits of competition for consumers will manifest themselves anyway. How the authorities should carry out this task will obviously depend on the nature of the markets, an aspect that Professor Petit deals brilliantly in the book. Therefore, the author promotes a much more dynamic and also richer antitrust analysis than the ones that results from a more static static framework. It's an approach certainly worth discussing, and I'm sure this webinar will be very enlightening for the audience. So thank you very much for being here, and I hope this will be an interesting discussion.
Thank you, Harald, and welcome everybody. As director of CeCo, a competition center of the Adolfo Ibáñez University, I'm pleased to welcome you to this seminar. And as Harald told us, our seminar today has a great topic and a great guest. The subject is nothing less than big tech and free competition, a global perspective. And this is currently the sexiest topic among competition lawyers and economists. And it is a dynamic theme in constant motion. Even just last Friday, 5 bills were filed to the United States Congress on this matter in what promises to be one of the major amendments to the competition law of the United States. Our speaker is the prominent lawyer and academic Nicolas Petit, and he comes to tell us about his recent book, Big Tech and Digital Economy, the Oligopoly Scenario, published by Oxford University Press in 2020. Mr. Petit is a professor at the European University Institute in Florence and at the College of Europe in Bruges, and has a PhD and 3 master's degrees. After Professor Petit's presentation, Professor Daniela Gorab, who has a master's degree in LSE and another in UCL, will make comments. Daniela is currently a minister at the Chilean Antitrust Court and director of the master's degree in business law at this university. After Daniela's comments, we will invite Alex Galetovic, who had the idea of this seminar. Alex is a senior fellow at this university and a research fellow at the Hoover Institution, and has a PhD from Princeton. And after this presentation, Nicolas will be able to react to Daniela's and Alex's comments, and then they will be able to answer questions from the audience. So please ask your questions in the chat, and Alex will process them in the final part of the seminar. In few more weeks, we will have another seminar organized by CeCo on the same topic, but applied to our Latin American region. This seminar will be in Spanish, and we will present an original paper commissioned by CeCo to 2 renowned lawyers, which will be commented on by leading practitioners from Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, and Peru. I hope you enjoy, and Nicolas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? To CeCo and buenos dias.
We can hear you.
Okay, so buenos dias. I will stop talking Spanish here because since I'm in Italy, I've been trying to learn Italian, and as you know, the languages are very close, and every time I speak Spanish now, I mess it up with Italian, and every time I speak Italian, I mess it up with Spanish. So I never really know which language I'm talking about, what language I'm talking, and which thing I'm talking about. So it's very confusing. But I've been a learner of Spanish way before Italian. So which tells you which language is really my real language, foreign language. I want to just start by just saying a word of appreciation to CeCo in particular, and also to Alex Galetovic, who's been a key source of inspiration for most of what you will read in the book, and especially in chapter 3 and chapter 4. I spent a lot of time with Alex 3 years ago in Stanford University. We discussed a lot. Alex gave me what I didn't have, in the sense that I'm a lawyer, and as much as I like economics, I'm not educated in economics. And Alex was kind enough to take my hand and help me going up the learning curve. by myself, and it really helped me, gave me pushback on ideas, and every time in a spirit of help and benevolence and improvement. So this is this book, and as you can see in the acknowledgements, is in a way dedicated to him, and has a bit of him inside it. So that's what I wanted to say. And now I'll just go to the gist of the presentation, and I'll share my screen. Okay, you can see my slides. Felipe, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, very good. Okay, so I spent the past 5 years thinking about this big tech thing, and at the time the debate was pretty hot, but now the debate has become absolutely frenetic and torrid. It's the conversation has reached temperature levels which are nothing compared to anything that in my short life as an academic have witnessed before. Now, my initial ambition was to write about these 6 tech giant companies: Google, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Microsoft, and Apple, companies known as FANGs. And the intuition behind the book came a few years ago in reading very diverse sources of information about the tech world. So the trigger of the book was really sort of disconnect between daily talks in the tech community about broad-based levels of competition amongst the FANG firms, broad-based levels of innovation, value, and jobs creation and productivity improvements by these firms. And on the other hand, the description in the mainstream press of tech monopolies, bigness, conglomeration, and other and all other possible evils associated with large firms and concentrated market structures. Now, a related point that really intrigued me at the time was the little attention paid to what economists call dynamism. And so in the antitrust fields, lots of people were looking at big tech market share durability as a sign of stasis. And there was limited interest in trying to understand what was driving this sort of very frantic trying and testing and turnaround moves of big tech firms, introducing products, phasing out products, trying new markets, getting out of markets which don't work. And what I found interesting was, so I found interesting to discuss whether Google or Facebook had enjoyed a dominant market share for 10 years, but I found equally or more interesting to try to understand if Facebook and Google were the same firms as 10 years before, right? And I had the feeling that this segment of the discussion was completely swept under the rug. And so these shortcuts in the public conversation led me to dig deeper, and trained as a lawyer and being at best an amateur economist, as I was saying, I approached the issue as a complete ignorance. So I decided to place myself behind the veil of ignorance, and I went to the antitrust specialist scholarship, and what I found there was essentially sort of a very sterile conversation between two camps, and this conversation still exists today. It's actually much bigger now. So on the one hand, you have a movement called neo-Brandeis, the neo-Brandeisian movement. I call them the neo-structuralists in the book. And they make very bold claims. It's really a sort of biggest bad movement, and they attack bigness, they attack market share, they attack industry concentration. And on top of that, they say that, so, big is bad, and big is a source of a whole host of problems, not just high prices, but they talk about harms to democracy, hate speech, lost privacy, all sorts of evils. Now, I was really not impressed by, and I'm still not impressed by what I read from this movement, because it's sort of, it's nice in terms at the claim level, because it makes very big claims, so it's always funny to listen to big claims. But when you look deeper, it works a lot on political polarization, not political conversation. It uses a very funky approach to history, sort of nitpicking, sort of cherry picking episodes in history, which kind of push the point, and discounting others which are adverse to the points. But more importantly, and frankly, I have a really big problem with that, is as soon as you start to push the neo-Brandeisian into trying to articulate operational test filters and measures for what they want to do, there's just an empty void. There's nothing. So there's the neo-Brandeisian movement operates free of the constraints of realism and of the constraints that bear on the administrative and judicial application of the law, the requirements of evidence-based enforcement, and other things which make it necessary to not be an arbitrary set of prescriptions. Now, on the other side of so I went to the other side of the table in a way, and what I found there was also interesting, but a little frustrating. I mean, I found in the literature the sort of what I call the consumer welfarists, to which I think I belong more than the neo-Brandeisian. But I found a lot of repeats of arguments which we had seen in the 1960s, where hypothetical efficiency possibilities were invoked in the service of an argument that anything big tech does is just completely legit and economically optimal. And even though in that conversation you have another strand, which are the post-Chicagoan, which sort of say, okay, we need to be a little more, we need to revisit, and we need to be more strict with big tech firms. This other movement, this derivation in the post-Chicagoan conversation never really says what's special to big tech, never really explains. They just seem to want a little more enforcement, so they want to revisit doctrine in favor of a little more enforcement, because a little more enforcement is good. But there's no, that is not tied to a very concrete economic demonstration that things would be better if there was more enforcement. So I left all these discussions a little disconcerted, and I had to think really hard to try to do and find something else. So I couldn't go deeper, so I went broader, and I did a sort of factual, so I decided to look at the facts more closely. That's what I really did, and to lay down a hypothesis, which I call the oligopoly hypothesis. And the oligopoly hypothesis, in a way, is inspired by Joseph Schumpeter. So in 1942, Schumpeter writes about the possibility of competition without competitors. And the oligopoly hypothesis builds on this idea. So it advances that the press and the policy-making world blindness to levels of big tech competition is not so much a question of ideology, but it's more a question of methodology. So more precisely, policymakers focus on rivalry, structure, and static competition might hide significant levels of competitive pressure and significant channels of competitive pressure. And they might leave aside significant independent variables like managers, dynamic capabilities, and innovation. So a way to test this hypothesis that the neo-Brandeisian and some antitrust agencies and experts and the policy-making structure, which really doesn't like big tech, it's what we have today in front of us. If they think that there's so much monopoly, It's not so much a question of ideology. They are biased against big tech because they don't like them, but it has a lot to do with the methods. This is the oligopoly hypothesis. And one way to check whether this hypothesis is true is to do something pretty simple. It's to ask whether experts, not laypersons, that operate outside of the domain of competition policy, antitrust, and economic regulation, do or not, on average, equally categorize big tech firms as monopolies. Okay, so you'd go to expertise, and you try to see if people with expertise on these firms, but expertise different from the very special antitrust expertise, do also talk about big tech firms as monopolies. Sorry about that. Now, to operationalize this test, I've assembled data sets with all the yearly filings, the 10Ks, and this is again probably some Alex influence here. All the 10Ks of the 6 FANG firms, these are filings that are made yearly before the US Securities and Exchange Commission. And I've also collected and assembled company profiles from 17 vendors of market research, business analysis, and competitive intelligence. So things like, what Standard & Poor's or Bloomberg or Capital IQ are doing when they analyze firms and their industries. They do a lot of work on industry competition and the size and trajectories and the nature of competition related to these firms. Okay, so this is what I did. So the data that I have tends to suggest 3 things. One is that there seems to be a coexistence of structural monopoly, you see a monopoly share, and cognitive oligopoly, what I call cognitive oligopoly. So 10K and market research call attention to the existence of latent, not patent, levels of competition. So here I show here how firms report in their 10Ks about the various risk factors that they believe their businesses are exposed to. And so, in every 10K, every year, they have to rank risk factors. And, sometimes it can be the pandemic, or it can be counterfeiting, or it can be political shocks or instability, or it can be a currency, monetary policy and currency shocks, things of this kind, inflation. And interestingly, the big tech firms, they tend to say that competition is a very important risk factor. Okay, so the second thing that you see, that this is very different from what you observe in other industries. So this is again the risk factor ranking. It's very close to 0. It's very close to 1 and 2. It's a very high risk. It's ranked very high for the MAGNAFs, the FANG firms. You can see them on the left. MAGNAF is like FANG. It's Microsoft, Apple, Google, Netflix, Amazon, and Facebook. And so the risk factors are clustered between 0 and 5 in terms of the ranking. Whereas for other industries, the risk factor of competition is clustered, between, if you take, for instance, credit reporting, between 7 and 12. So you can see that there's a sort of industry singularity in terms of the perceived level of competition that the FANG firms are exposed to. And last but not least, and that's very interesting, I think I really like this chart because it's just quite funny to look at that. There is a lot of heterogeneity between the 6 firms in terms of how they perceive their competition. So for instance, if you take firms like Amazon and Google, which appear on the left-hand side, you can see that, so the area with the dots corresponds to corresponds to how many angles of competition they're exposed to. So the more spread out the area between the dots, the more the other FANG firms exert competitive pressure on the business. And so you can see that Google and Amazon tend to say that they're exposed to a lot of competition from Microsoft, Apple, and for Google, Facebook, and for Amazon, Netflix. Okay. By contrast, other firms like Apple on the right-hand side in the lower region of the screen, if you look at Apple, Apple defines as its main competitor Microsoft and doesn't seem to be really worried about competition from Netflix, Amazon, and Facebook. Okay, so that again tells you that if there is competition on the FANG firms, the amounts and magnitude of the competitive threats that bear on the business, this is not measurements, this is just perception, might be different. Okay, so I remember having a discussion with Alex once at Hoover, and Alex told me, you will need to identify some regularities in what you see. You know, if you want to, I mean, you know, it could be if I want to build a theory, I'm not really trying to build a theory in the sense that I'm not sure when I do research that I want to come to a theory. I mean, this is fake, you know, you just need to get what you put your hands on material and see if that makes sense as a pattern to, and then decide if there's a theory or there's not a theory. But Alex was telling me, you know, if there is some meat to the idea that there is competition there that we don't see, you should be able to detect some regularities in the material that you're using. And I tried to do my best to manipulate the reports and the sources of analysis I had in a qualitative way, but to highlight what I believed were sort of properties which are rarely discussed in antitrust, but which really matter when you read through these reports. And I identified really there were six observable things which really jumped to my head, or you know, or jump to my face when you read through these reports. So the first one is diversification. So you can see these firms, they are very conglomerate. They are not just one search engine. You know, they enter into and penetrate all sorts of markets. If you take Google, or if you take even Netflix or Amazon, and you know, Amazon is acquiring Hollywood studios and football rights in Europe. So they are doing a lot of stuff. And the hard question is, what is the trajectory of this diversification? I mean, do they, you know, would Amazon tomorrow become a bank or a health company or something of this kind? What is the common denominator that explains the trajectory of diversification? And here, in a way, you have this, you know, tendency to explain things by reliance on data and big data. In the book, I try to advance something a little more nuanced, which is that these firms try to specialize in data, of course, in the data-related business, but they really try to play with what I call data sensors and data servers. So they really build the tools that allow to collect data and also allow to process data. And I think that gives you a hint as to the direction of diversification. This continuity, so these firms seem to be obsessed by changes, events, or shifts which alter the competitive landscape by reallocating strategic advantages, and might play a very key role in the demise of and ruin of certain and the fortune of others. So this is interesting because in a way this ties also to the data points. So some people talk a lot about data is the new oil, or data are the new oil. And I tend to think that data are the new Lego more than the new oil. Data can be recombined to create new products and services, and that creates a lot of instability and opportunity sensing, seizing, and implementation. Long-termism, it's interesting that these firms, they have very high R&D expenses, but they also, on top of the R&D points, they also have very high levels, or some of them, very high level of retained earnings. So they retain the earnings in the company, they don't return the earnings to their shareholders. And that's an interesting fact as well, because no functional Wall Street company would be allowed for a lot of time to keep the money in the company and not return that to shareholders. And that tells you a little bit about their time horizon. Growth is another one, no need to be long here. It's pretty clear that these firms, they're really about not so much profit maximization. That's probably a goal, but they're on top of that, they really want to grow the business as Bill Baumol explained in a book. And maybe these firms really correspond to what Bill Baumol had predicted in a book. Exploration, the firms are very exploratory in terms of their innovation. So they do not only follow outcome, problem solving or goal-driven type of innovation processes, they are more open-ended. So they do a little bit of, they do both. And that's also quite striking. And last, flexibility. So flexibility is they tend to reorganize, they tend to change. If you look at a company like Microsoft has undergone like 10 reorganization in the past 20 years. And so they really try a lot to change and adjust and pivot on a very, very rapid basis. Okay. So this is really what I think I observed. And when I talk to people in the Silicon Valley, they tell me, I don't want to brag about the book or, say, I'm right and everyone's wrong. That's certainly not my point. But I can tell you that every time I speak to people in the Silicon Valley, they tell me your chapter 4 in the book really puts words on what we feel every day. And so to me, it's interesting, and I like to hear that because I really try to understand them really hard, a bit as if I was a shrink to the big tech companies. And they tell me, it's really how we feel about the competitive environments. Okay, now the hard question is, how do you reconcile all these facts together in service of something a little more predictive, which is maybe theory or model building? And so one way to think about this is to start from the point that these firms, and accept the point that these firms enjoy a monopoly in an origins markets, but at the same time that they are the players of a dynamic oligopoly game in multitudinous markets. So, you can take Google search. Of course, Google is dominant in search, but then they are playing a lot of other games in other markets in oligopoly competition. And the examples are just, so clear. You just need to pause for a minute and try to list. So you can think about payments, messaging, streaming video, productivity applications, hardware tablets, cloud computing, podcasting, wearables, artificial reality, virtual reality, self-driving cars. I mean, there's so many markets besides the search engine market. And I just tell you, you take 5 minutes of your time and you just focus on one of these firms and try to think really hard about how many markets they are involved in. And so unless you're completely narrow-minded, you can't just really ignore that all these assets and resources are going into these markets, right? The world is not like it has. A surgeon would examine you but never really take your heartbeat when you're subject to an accident. I mean, this is just you'd never do that, right? Or not take your temperature because it's a different mechanism from your foot or your knee. I mean, this is just weird. So what ties this together is the following. I try to explain that in the book, is that the modular or the recombinant nature of digital information, that's really the core thing in tech. So data can be recombined with handset, watches, cars, cultural content to create richer apps, richer programs, richer services. This creates a huge discontinuity risk on big tech rents in monopoly markets, right? So in other words, the set of production possibilities with digital technology is very large. And what happens is that if a company finds the next killer application, the monopoly rents, the monopoly products might become a ghost town with all the value going to the next application, right? This is just a process of Schumpeterian competition. There's less surplus to extract in the monopoly markets when there's discontinuity created by the recombining and the recombinant supply of new products and services. And so, you know, if you want to think about this, driverless cars in the future might provide entry points for entertainment and advertisements services other than the living room monopoly over which Netflix today sits comfortably, right? So when we spend 4 hours in our cars, what we'll do in the car will displace a lot of value that Netflix is currently extracting by, you know, taking maybe a rent, I don't know, when you're sitting in the sofa watching movies and shows. So big tech do not and cannot ignore this, and so they willingly participate in that competition for the next application in what I call untipped markets, that oligopoly competition, due to a bunch of properties like externalities, increasing returns to adoption, and tipping effects. These games are finite. In one way, it's a game of competition for the market rather than in the market. And they are stochastic in the sense that it's very hard to determine what are the payoffs, who are the players of this game, and what are the rules in the next repetition. So all this ties into a sort of big soup that people like David Tees call deep uncertainty. Okay, and maybe the levels of deep uncertainty that bear on big tech are just higher than the levels of uncertainty that bear on most traditional businesses. Okay, so I'll try to move fast because I know Alex asked me to discuss current policy developments. So the policy implication that I foresee in the book in chapter 5 are the following. So I say in the book that one thing that we might want to try to do is so we as an antitrust minded person, you should be very happy that firms even with a monopoly position feel under such pressure that they do not display inertial behavior. They display very aggressive behavior. They price low, they invest in R&D, they constantly try to improve products and services, they restructure and reorganize all the time. So that pressure is an outcome that you should feel happy with. So what I say in the book is, I say, when this pressure disappears because the risk of discontinuity has disappeared, you might want as an antitrust regulator or agency to place priority on the tipped markets in which the monopoly firm can extract the monopoly rents without having to reinvent itself, okay? And by putting pressure on this market in which there is some monopoly rents, you might create a shock on the firm sufficient for it to explore new business opportunities in other markets, okay? If you say, you know, it's no longer going to work to take the rent and just sit idly on your large dominance position, go explore other markets. At the same time, what I say in the book, and that's pretty controversial, I say we should let these big tech firms free to explore business opportunities in other markets. So there's so, you know, in the antitrust field, there's one thing that people believe, but which is completely wrong, which is that anything that a new entrant can do, an incumbent can do better, okay? And so this is the basis for a very bad presumption against leveraging by incumbent companies. This idea has no teeth and no foundation. You know, it's not a given that the incumbents in market A will be better than in the others in market B, and so there should not be a presumption of harm against these firms. So this is a sort of broad policy implication of the book. Let's focus efforts on lazy big tech firms, which take rent in tip markets, and let's not really harm the non-lazy big tech firms that might occupy a position, you know, a large position in the tip market, but keep exploring and exploring and exploring and exploring. Okay, so what I say in the book is we can do a lot with existing antitrust. We don't need to throw everything that we have, or, you know, even go into the perils of legislative reform. We just need to tweak a little enforcement priorities, and we can do a lot. So what I say is we can try to use multi-sided market theory to limit indirectly monopoly rents in tipped markets. And I also have this sort of proposal for a strong presumption against horizontal mergers in tipped markets. What you want to do is you just want to reduce the monopoly rent to give enough incentives for the firms to move away and explore in tipped markets. Now, this has been very controversial in the reception of the book. Some people have told me you're too forgiving towards leveraging conduct by big tech firms. So the diversification of big tech firms, I say, I don't see any problem with that. In a way, they can take the risk. It's a good thing. So I explain all that in the book, so I don't want to bore you for too long with this. But also some people have told me this is unrealistic because it's impractical what you're saying, this division between tipped and untipped markets, and we don't have a tool to do that. And I say, okay, sure. I know it's not easy, but think for a minute about all the time we spent in antitrust arguing about market definition and dominance, as if this was an easy process. I mean, not a case today in antitrust is either praised or destroyed by critics on the grounds of erroneous or plausible market definition. So, I'd say we have this discussion for 30 years about market def and how bad it is or how great it is. Maybe we need another construct. And I provide tips and pointers in the book towards how to define tipped and untipped markets. Okay, now, one source of frustration in the law and economics community about all this is that much of the mainstream policymakers and economists. I'm just concerned that my battery is running out, so let me check that for a minute. Sorry about that. It's supposed to be plugged. I know what's going on. Sorry about this. You can see that my screen is becoming a bit dark, so that's a bad sign. I'll be with you in 10 seconds. Yeah, I have a problem. I have a power problem. Maybe that's the moderator who say that I'm speaking too long. Actually, if I could have an idea of time, it would be great. Okay, we have a situation here. I'm sorry, give me a minute because I'm going to have a big problem otherwise.
Go ahead.
Big Tech.
Un sabotaje, ¿no? Sufrió un sabotaje. Oye, ¿cómo rellenamos a Alex mientras tanto? Mientras consigue electricidad, Petit. Estás muteado ahí. Ahí sí.
A mí me parece muy interesante esta idea. Creo que o al menos para mí la idea más interesante del libro es que estas firmas son... lo que hacen estas firmas es poner sensores en todas partes.
I have power now.
Are you okay? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry about that. First time this happens. There must be a first to everything. Okay, yeah, you see that. Okay, so I was saying one source of frustration for people like me in this community that the debate has been really sort of hijacked by policy-making minded activists in law and in the economics profession, and everyone has sort of followed the regulators and provided theories and evidence for what they wanted to see. And I've been really amazed by the little degree of critical re-examination of certain policy positions which were advanced very early by people in the economics and the law profession. Everyone has sort of, jumped on the big tech bandwagon to advance, justification for the big is bad kind of narrative. And even though there's been a lot of nuance, trying to say that you feel there is some competition in this space feels really like being a sort of heterodox lawyer or economist. It's really hard to disagree with the consensus. You look like you're living on a different planet. And one reason for this is that I think that the tool that we have in industrial organization theory, again, do not really look at things which are extremely important to understand big tech. And they don't do that because it's very hard to measure these things. So I had a previous slide here where I was talking about things like, moving away from very narrow partial equilibrium models, which do not account for phenomena outside of typical markets. An issue that a lot of people in business and management science talk about is the role of managers in the firm. The firm is not a black box. Ronald Coase himself was talking about that in his Nobel Prize lecture. And things like dynamism. So if you think about game theory, for instance, game theory is not very dynamic. Game theory is pretty static, and it doesn't account for feedback loop, reflexivity, learning effects, and things of this kind. So you would have expected that the economics profession a long time ago would have sort of said, okay, there's a lot of complexity unaccounted for by our models, and maybe big tech is a good time in the history of our profession to do the work. But I think a lot of people in the economics profession were probably more pressed by the publication agenda constraints and the sort of natural incentive to make impact in policy making. Have sort of jumped and applied the old tools to this. I have to say that people like Ken Arrow, who are often cited, the Nobel Prize economist Ken Arrow, of all names, who are often cited, to say that monopoly is bad for innovation, which I think in a way is a misquote as well, if you read carefully the paper that he wrote in '67, I think. People like Ken Arrow in 1996, discussed these issues and said, we might have been wrong with our models. And we need to do more work on complexity theory, increasing returns, and disequilibrium, things of this kind. And he wrote papers talking about that and how the information economy was maybe a good case study of all these issues. So we need economists today to roll up their sleeves and, rather than trying to adduce evidence that confirms the theories of the policymakers, give us new tools to measure the phenomena that are there. Okay, so what has happened since the book, and I'll close here. So we've seen, again, a frenetic policy agenda shaping before our eyes, and initiatives everywhere in the world. So it's focused only on US and Europe, and I'm sorry I'm not talking about South America here, because I know it less. So in the US, things have moved under, I think, what I call a pure antitrust approach. So we see litigation under existing rules and proposals for technical modifications in legislative bills. So the Amy Klobuchar bill, for instance, proposes things like a reversal of the burden of proof. And this would apply to all industries, not only big tech, right? But big tech is a bit like a locomotive in this discussion, right? It's the case that brings all the others with them. In Europe, the approach is slightly different. It's a hybrid approach where we see the antitrust decision makers making more cases in a way to show the limits of the instrument, and we see regulation advancing very fast in Congress. So in the European Parliament and in the UK, there's proposals to change things, and the models here are models of targeted regulation, just on a few firms, often called gatekeepers. The idea is probably, I think the idea that's sort of a common theme in these efforts is to force the companies to share assets and also to try to reduce their ability to reduce the profitability of moving away from their core markets, what I call soft line of business restrictions, really not my cup of tea. And also these proposals are based not only on efficiency considerations, but also on fairness issues, even though no regulator so far has provided a clear definition of what fairness means. And this will be a big problem in the future. So here is a sample of the cases that we've seen. The FTC case against Facebook, the DOJ case against Google, the US states case against Google, and the Epic versus Apple case, where there's a dispute over essentially the size of the fee that Apple takes for downloads and payments from payments to developers. In the EU, we have a bunch of cases. I don't need to go there. I'm sure you all know what it's all about. The case against Amazon and Facebook, mostly about data. They're interesting. Okay, the issues in the discussion, there are issues about burden of proof. There's the concept of killer acquisitions, which come often. You know, should these firms be able to buy whoever they want and startups? And by doing that, they do this sort of thing where future Facebook will not happen because Facebook bought it before, and that's Instagram. Gatekeeping, this is sort of essential facility kind of thing where they can the platforms can decide whether you have a breathing space on the platform or not. Breakups, should we break up these companies? Should we break up Google into a Fugle, a Moogle, a Zoogle, and Doogle? Should we sever the tie between Google and YouTube? So horizontal and vertical breakups. And other things like in Article 19.1 of the DMA, the EU proposal, you have things like allowing agencies and regulators to get access to algorithms and data models and data calibration models used by these firms. So lots of very strategic information that they might be able to, regulators might be able to gain access to. Okay, so I've put a slide here with the hard policy questions. I don't know, am I over time? Yes, no, you can tell me.
You can go on for a couple of minutes.
Yeah,
Okay.
No problem.
Very good. So I've tried really hard to think about the hard policy question that we face today, and I've put a bunch of them. Maybe you have more, and I'd love to hear you. So here is a sample. So first question: if a breakup of big tech is doable, so you can do the breakup, it's not really hard to know where you have to force divestiture. This is an argument made by John Quokka and Thomas Ovelletti, who was the former chief economist of DG Comp. It's not hard to break up a digital firm compared to breaking up a steel or an aluminum company. The real question is this socially beneficial? When you have increasing returns to adoption and when you have economies of scale on the supply side. It is something you really want to do. I mean, people find a lot of convenience in having a large user base on a network and a large amount of complementary services on a platform. It's convenience. So economies of scale and scope and increasing returns to adoption. So this is the hard question. The hard question is not whether it's feasible to break up a big tech company. Okay, well. The other hard policy question is, when do platforms' rents become unjustified and require government intervention? This is at the heart of the Epic versus Apple case and the other Apple cases in Europe, where there's a dispute, where there's not, the dispute is not really the dispute in the in litigation. The litigated dispute is not about that, but the real dispute is about that. Can Apple take a 30% commission on downloads of apps through the App Store, or payments for in-app purchases through the Apple ecosystem? And so the question is this: the question is, Apple created the App Store in the end 2000s. We are 13 years after that. The commission has not changed much, as I understand. Is this stable and fixed commission taken by Apple monopoly rents? And if this is so, at what point in time can we decide, like, for IP, we do 20 years. Is there a point in time at which the government can intervene legitimately and efficiently to say, you had enough? Monopoly profit recoupment, you had enough time to recoup the risks of investments through a monopoly rents. This is what I want to say. Okay, a third question is, should we accept as a society, and on what grounds, a world, an economy in which there's a competitive oligopoly of very large and growing mega firms? So, in a way, maybe the future of the digital economy is a world in which there's only, 6 large companies organizing the economy, plus satellites organizing the economy, right? In a way, you could think of a world of this kind. Is this something that we are ready to live with, and under what conditions? So I'm just a little exaggerating here the points. Fourth question, which is a key issue in Europe, and I think it will become a key issue in the discussion of this regulation, the DMA, especially with strong positions from the Greens in Germany and other countries against it, is the business model of targeted advertisements. Is this a business model that should be disabled, or the costs of which should be increased? Okay. Fourth, how to promote horizontal differentiation towards more privacy-friendly offerings in digital services? How can we how can we organize an economy in which there will be ability and incentives for firms to profitably build more privacy compliant, more privacy-friendly services, competing with Google and Facebook? And is this possible? Okay. Sixth question, is algorithmic technology value-free? There's a lot of discussion about biases by algorithms. What do they say about values? And it's a really hard discussion. Should states, so should public intervention, should governments try to establish domestic big tech capabilities? And is this creating a risk of industrial policy in disguise with all the things that we know that are bad about industrial policy? Or is there a middle way? And last but not least, how can countries, localities in Europe, I think it's mostly a challenge for everything but China and the US. How can South America and Europe create a Silicon Valley, right? How can we do that? And of course, these are really hard questions, but I think if I was talking to a policymaker who's not necessarily interested in technical details, these are the questions I would ask. And these are the questions that my book doesn't really address. Okay, so I close with that. As I said, it's been a bit of a lonely journey since I published the book, because a lot of the sort of opinions have crystallized around sort of really mainstream. People talk about a consensus today. If there's a consensus, I'm really not in it, I have to say, and it's a bit sad. But I have to say that maybe it's just a question of time. And I can read changes in the conversation, and I can hear people who've not expressed themselves talk more openly about about these issues. And people like Bent Armstrong or Ariel Pakes or David Teese and a bunch of others are starting to say, you know, we need to take more time to study this more carefully. It will take 15 years to understand what's at play here and to build the tools to understand it. The problem is the political cycle is very impatient, and you know, in a way, this is a bit bad, but it's also due to these big tech firms which have created this, you know, demand and supply of instant attention. So that's all I had to say. Thanks for your attention. I hope it was not too high level and it was clear enough for everyone. Thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you, Nicolas. Alex?
I think Daniela now will comment.
Daniela, yes.
Thank you, Felipe, and thank you to CeCo for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. Before starting, just a quick disclaimer. Opinions expressed here are my own and not the views of the competition tribunal. Well, Nicolas' book is fantastic. To me, the relevance of this contribution to the ongoing debate on digital platforms is twofold: methodological and substantive. In terms of methodology, the oligopoly hypothesis is properly substantiated by empirical data using an innovative technique. As Nicolas mentioned, data stems from outside the antitrust world to assess whether tech firms are monopolies and understand their competitive environment. Substantively, it provides a new analytical framework of indirect entry that sheds light on the competition among digital platforms from a dynamic perspective, identifying different competitive pressures they face, such as uncertainty. Ultimately, it enables us to better understand the rationality of big tech's behavior. It's also very timely. When the public discourse encourages more competition enforcement and more regulation on digital platforms, and the debate on tech giants is increasingly polarized and politicized. In fact, it comes up in times when agencies in both sides of the Atlantic are bringing several complaints against tech giants and the different regulatory initiatives coming up, as you may see in the slide. For instance, new regulations have been laid out in Germany, in the UK, by the European Commission with its Digital Markets Act proposal, and last Friday, as Felipe mentioned, a bipartisan legislative bill in the House of Representatives was introduced to regulate digital platforms. That being said, I would like to highlight three issues. Firstly, the book strikes at the heart of competition policy by raising questions on what does antitrust pursue. Actually, Chapter 1 starts by reviewing the two main approaches related to competition goals and their policy proposals on big tech firms. On one hand, there is the neo-structuralism, and on the other, the consumer welfare standard. In this respect, let me use a metaphor Nicolas mentions in Chapter 6 when he refers to his model, which is the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. It means that the fox, despite his cunning, can be defeated by the hedgehog's one defense, its sharp quills. The aphorism can be construed as the hedgehog having a universal organizing principle, whereas foxes adopt multiple and even contradictory principles. So arguably, the neo-structuralists or neo-Brandesians see antitrust as a fox because even if their criticism hinges on bigness, they encourage the inclusion of non-economic and political goals in antitrust policy. Actually, they argue that digital ecosystems threaten democracy, as Nicolas said. They undermine the political process and free speech, and their main concern is about small firms' protection. I agree with Nicolas in that considering other goals in antitrust would increase vagueness in the law, discretion in decision-making, and could chill efficient outcomes. This group proposes the abrogation of the consumer welfare standard. They support a no-fault liability regime on the basis of structural dominance and to break up tech giants to disperse economic and political concentration based on past antitrust cases such as AT&T. I see little merit in these proposals, particularly on breaking up tech firms, because it's likely that it would remove the network effects that benefit consumers. In terms of institutional design, some neo-Brandesians even advocate to take antitrust away from the courts and minimize judicial review. This is problematic to me because it would leave antitrust even more exposed to political and time-inconsistent views. I like that the book aims to rule out the big is bad dogma proposed by the neo-Brandesians, challenging the idea that bigness itself is inherently bad in digital markets. In contrast, consumer welfarism would view competition policy as a hedgehog because it clearly argues that the prohibitions in competition law require a factual assessment on how a conduct can reduce or is likely to reduce economic welfare, and therefore competition law is not intended to prevent non-economic harm as the political process and other social objectives. Both the US and the EU have embraced the standard as the goal of competition law, although the EU is not limited to it. As you may know, under consumer welfare, performance and not just structure must inform antitrust enforcement, and antitrust protects competition rather than competitors. In relation to digital markets, Nicolas reckons that both approaches have limitations and methodological issues, and that an additional inquiry is needed to understand competition issues raised by tech giants. In response, the book offers a sort of a third approach, the oligopoly scenario. Yet, the book acknowledges that the truth is more likely to come out under a rigorous application of the consumer welfare standard. In this sense, I believe that the oligopoly model fits well in the consumer welfare rationale, as it enables us to understand how these firms behave and their incentives in a dynamic environment with uncertainty. So tech giants differ from the textbook monopoly model because their ecosystems have network effects, tipping points, and increasing returns to adoption. All these elements could be understood under consumer welfare. I believe this standard is reasonable and is able to address the concerns arising from digital platforms. The limitations come from the approach taken by some antitrust doctrine and some case law, particularly from the US, rather than from the standard itself. I believe that consumer welfare is not monolithic, as critics say. It does not limit to the price-output dichotomy. It's not only about consumer surplus, that it's static in nature. So the assumption that consumer welfare is only concerned about short-term output and prices is mistaken. Instead, the assessment of anti-competitive conducts should also embrace dynamic efficiencies and innovation, and some jurisprudence and the literature already address dynamic competition and entry. Also, there is no blind gap, as critics allege, due to the zero monetary prices on some consumer-facing services. First, there is a price, given that users pay with time, personal data, and attention. Second, constraints stem from the analytical tools used, such as market definition and market shares to assess market power. I agree with Nicolas in this regard. These tools can yield a myopic view of competition when looking at digital platforms, so problems would be related to the tools and not to the standard. In this context, we need to recalibrate antitrust enforcement and improve the toolbox. This implies developing new theories of harm for digital ecosystems. Theories of harm that can understand platforms' behavior and how multi-sided market issues interact with conglomerates or platforms that are active across multiple markets. And the oligopoly model substantially contributes to enhance this toolbox. However, I have only one caveat concerning the oligopoly approach. It's about the role of consumer data as a competition parameter, as well as a source of market power of tech giants. We still don't have a univocal answer on how we should address data in competition enforcement, but I do agree there's a trade-off. On one hand, due to economies of scale and scope in data aggregation and analytics, the social value of data exceeds its private value. So Positive externalities arise from the ability of platforms to collect data, accelerating the learning by doing of algorithms and driving network effects. This is what the doctrine knows as the feedback loop or reinforcing effects, as you may see in the slide. At the same time, data-driven externalities can be a source of market power. They may lead to market tipping and anti-competitive behavior affecting business as well as final users. So data may lead to entrenched dominance in markets with network effects. In this regard, there's some new economic research proposing plausible theories of harm related to the collection and use of consumer data. For instance, new theories of harm that involve tying as an envelopment strategy, leveraging across multi-sided platform markets, and raising rivals' cost in the case of platforms involving app stores. These insights suggest that data plays a pivotal role in shaping market outcomes, as it can be a barrier to entry or expansion and a mechanism to foreclosure. So I think it should be considered in merger assessment and in abuse of dominant cases. We need more research like this, considering that a price-centric approach is ill-suited to guide enforcement because quality and innovation, both related to data, and although are hard to quantify, are also important dimensions of competition. In that context, competition enforcement when assessing data should be cautious so that it preserves the positive externalities, but it prevents its negative effects. Considering that, my question is, how would the oligopoly model address this trade-off arising from data-driven externalities, and particularly to the role of data in tipping markets? Finally, I would like to provide some insights on a very topical issue, the regulation of digital platforms. The question is, do we need ex-ante regulation of big tech firms? The book refers to regulation when it identifies the forces underpinning uncertainty that tech giants face, and as a source of discontinuity that reallocate the strategic advantages among them, the regularities, as Nicolas said. Finally, in the last chapter, it refers to regulation regarding novel harms arising from digital platforms, namely fake news, privacy violation, and hate speech. Except for privacy or data, when it can be a source of market power, as I explained before, I agree with Nicolas that such novel harms should not be addressed by antitrust policy. Antitrust is not ubiquitous, and so it should not solve all the issues raised by digital platforms. In this sense, we can turn again to the metaphor, stating that competition policy is more a hedgehog rather than a fox. Not everything is a competition problem. For example, when there are market failures, such as information asymmetry between platforms and users related to the provision of data and privacy, or when businesses try to deceive consumers, the regulatory response should come from consumer protection. Likewise, consumer protection should address consumers' behavioral biases that limit our ability to meaningfully engage with privacy policies and that can lead to an oversharing of our data. In turn, privacy protection regulation should safeguard individual rights on data. So these two frameworks, consumer protection and privacy, can complement competition because they also encourage efficient outcomes that involve the processing of consumer data. Indeed, if we users don't understand that the consumer data business collects, we will not be able to make decisions about privacy or quality and discipline them. Thus, business will have less incentives to compete on privacy. Having said that, I think we do need some sort of ex-ante regulation on digital platforms to complement competition enforcement. The main reason is that enforcement is low compared to the pace of the changing economic landscape of the digital world. So, what kind of regulation do we need? In this respect, I would like to comment the new Digital Markets Act proposal released by the European Commission. The core of the DMA hinges on two sets of obligations for platforms that are designated as gatekeepers. I think that these DMA's provisions are questionable. Particularly, Article 5 has a list of absolute provisions, a blacklist. It contains a list of do's and don'ts that does not admit any efficiency defense from gatekeepers except for very exceptional circumstances. The DMA states that these obligations have been limited to those practices that are particularly unfair or harmful and for which there is sufficient experience. The problem is that it establishes an absolute prohibition for conducts that, according to the case law and economic literature, could have both anti-competitive as well as pro-competitive effects, such as most favored nation clauses and tying and bundling. So it seems to me that in this sense, the European Commission is returning to the formalistic approach used in the 90s for abuse of dominance cases. For this kind of practices, I rather prefer a case-by-case analysis, assessing their actual or likely effects in the market and not a blanket prohibition. In this regard, I believe there is room for improvement in competition enforcement. For example, the burden of proof in these cases could be shifted so it relies on the digital ecosystem as the US legislative bills propose. Then, Article 6 lists a set of obligations subject to further specification by the European Commission. Given that it does not explain on which grounds this further assessment will be conducted, it leads to legal uncertainty and could have a chilling effect on innovation. As a final point, the asymmetric regulation of the DMA has drawbacks because it does not account for the different business models that digital platforms operate. I believe that a one-size-fits-all approach for regulating big techs is not adequate. In this respect, Nicolas' view is interesting when he states that there is heterogeneity among big tech firms and their strategies. Actually, he states that the arguments made in the book do not apply equally to the 6 GAFAM or FANGs. I agree with that. We should not look at GAFAMs with the same magnifying glass because their digital ecosystems operate different business models. I mean by that, their strategies to monetize the value created by the platform differ. There is interesting research in this regard. For example, Cafarra and Scott Morton argue that different business models shape the platform's incentives, and so they matter for competition as well as for welfare outcomes. They suggest that business models can determine, for example, the entry strategies of big tech competitors, the value of consumer data, the nature and extent of network effects, and the potential for multi-homing by users. As the slides show, we can find operating systems and device-funded platforms, ad-funded digital platforms, and transaction matchmaking platforms. To me, these insights about different business models are necessary for both effective antitrust enforcement and for ex-ante regulatory tools. I was wondering, it would be interesting to conduct further research on how the oligopoly model adapts to the different business models and to what extent the common properties or regularities set out by Nicolas apply thereof. In conclusion, I think the way the DMA is structured could have unintended consequences. It might even clash with competition enforcement of Article 102 of the treaty. Ultimately, sorry, time is up, but I'm wrapping up. Ultimately, I prefer the UK regulatory approach because it is a principle-based code of conduct rather than a rigid checklist, and it acknowledges the different business models that digital platforms operate. I leave it there. Thank you.
Estás muteado, eso. Estás muteado, Alex.
Aquí.
Ahí sí. Ahí sí.
Sí. So let me give thanks for being here. This is an exciting and thought-provoking book. I will try to bridge the book with the, let me call it, standard way of looking at these industries, which is centered on network externalities. What I will argue is that the book is well ahead of the tools that we have to think of the issues that the book highlights, and which I think the book makes a compelling case that cannot be ignored. And so my comments will end with some observations about current antitrust. The book doesn't solve the antitrust problem in big tech, of course, but my conclusion will be that this is not because a shortcoming of the book, but rather because simply before having the tools to address these problems, we need to have a better theory, which the book goes a long way in telling us what that theory has to consider. So let me go through the book's thesis. The book's thesis is that big tech firms are monopolies in tip markets and oligopolies in non-tip markets. I hesitate a bit to use the term monopoly in tip markets in the sense, because the book is somewhat, I mean, the book itself points out that a monopoly in a tip market is by far not a monopoly, is very unlike a monopoly in the standard textbook monopoly, both in terms of what their objectives are and, more importantly, in terms of the competitive pressures it faces. So, and I think this is one of the important and very, very compelling conclusions of the book and thesis of the book, which is that oligopolies compete in many dimensions. They compete for market share in their tip markets. They feel competitive pressure and they feel their market share under threat. They compete, of course, in developing new technologies. They compete in trying to reach discontinuities and tipping markets. They compete through indirect entry into other markets. The policy recommendation of the book is to limit monopoly rents in tip markets, not go and regulate them, but do things that limit rents in those markets and let them compete in untipped markets. So what I'm going to do in this comment is I'm going to go to the fundamental tension in tip markets. There is a fundamental tension that sometimes is ignored, and we get to the point that which is the neo-structuralist approach, which sees a bad in concentration. There is a more nuanced vision of that, which I want to spend some time on. Then I'm going to go through the oligopoly hypothesis, and then I will finish with some comments about the fundamental tension and the book's theory of harm and policy recommendation. So this is a platform. These firms are platforms. In a platform, you have a standard where you have a standard, and that is behind the reason why these platforms create network externalities. They put a standard, and interaction in that platform is more valuable than simply going and buying the service that the platform provides. And in any standard platform, we have service providers, and we have consumers who use services operated through the platform. So the quintessential platform is Apple's iPhone. We have apps. These are the service providers. We have consumers who use these apps, which are operated through the platform. And there is a series of standards that Apple imposes and rules that Apple imposes for the interaction of these two parts of the platform. And Apple charges money for to both sides of the platform in different ways and monetizes the value of the platform. The key issue, I think, and this is well known, the key issue is that standardization and network externalities are good. If you decompose willingness to pay in a platform by the willingness to pay for the individual benefit you get, and then willingness to pay for the benefit you get for participating in a platform, then these are two independent sources, or not independent, but rather different sources of willingness to pay by consumers or by somebody in the platform, because we all know that platforms will charge one side and not the other, and will do all sorts of interesting things about pricing. But in the very basic structure of the platform is the fact that the platform creates goods of value. I like to have ways that will tell me how to go from point A to B, but it also creates a network externality. It's a very good thing that many people are in Waze, because Waze can tell me where streets are congested, what choices others made that may improve my choices of how to get from A to B. So the source of willingness to pay is there. Now there's a different question, which is, how does the platform monetize this willingness to pay? That's a different issue, and that's pricing. And it may well be the case that you don't pay Waze for doing things, for the things Waze does for you, but somebody else pays for having the information about the things that you do with Waze. That's a different issue, but the willingness to pay in the end comes from some consumers or some surplus that is created for consumers. And so in a very simple way, we can graph this, that the demand or willingness to pay by consumers for what a platform offers is increased by the fact that there is interaction with others and that this network externality is created. Network externalities are many times seen as a bad thing because they make switching more expensive. But in the very basics of the the very root of a network externality is a benefit for a consumer, which consists on the benefits of interacting with other consumers, having more choice, benefiting of the information that other consumers create, and so on. Now, why can another platform compete? Well, if there are benefits and network externalities, there is utility in being all together in a single platform. This is exaggerated, of course. There are many cases there are more than one platform. There is Android, there is iOS, right? So there are two different platforms that interact, and I can do lots of things to interact with people in Android. So this is much more nuanced that this simple picture tries to depict. The problem here, of course, is that you may have, and that's the textbook example, you may have that somebody has a superior product, but it doesn't make it that only a few consumers leave you and participate in another platform. You need to get all consumers to shift in order to have this competition. And I think that this creates a fundamental tension. There is and the network externalities are good, but we do not like the concentration. Many people immediately jump into the conclusion that concentration is bad because there is market power, there is exclusion, and it's very difficult to unsee the monopoly. And I think one of the main contributions of the book, one of the very important contributions of the book, is to have operationalized the idea that these firms feel threatened. They feel threatened, and they don't see this scenario, the switch scenario, this one here, as something in which they are immune to it. quite the contrary, lots of things they do. And that's one, and that's exactly what I mean by the book going ahead of the tools. Much of what they do is determined by the fact that they want to avoid this from happening. And because of that, they feel a lot of competitive pressure, but we don't have the tools to analyze this competitive pressure. We don't have the tools to quantify. We don't have the tools to map these this competitive pressure into welfare, and except by a link to innovation, which we recognize that is a source of consumer surplus. But most of the time, it's this feature of platforms that gets the attention. There is one platform that is seemingly immune to competition. The book says, no, this is a very, very real threat for firms. Now, let me go to the book's argument. Big tech firms are simultaneously monopolists and competitive firms because they are subject to a form of pressure for firms outside of the product and service market that they serve alone, and also from indeterminate firms' market of industries. So think, for example, in the diagram that Nicolas showed about the distance you are from a competitor. It might well be the case that Apple feels that Netflix is not quite a competitor of Apple. It will not go into the phone business. Netflix will not go into the phone business and produce phones and create an app store. But it might well be the case that Netflix feels that Apple is a very real competitor to Netflix. Apple indeed has Apple TV, rents movies as just as Netflix does, and has a different business model. And it might well be the case that one business model upsets the other. So it's very clear why Netflix feels Apple is a competitor. And here I think the book goes into some important contributions in analysis. The book points out that oligopolies compete in many dimensions. They compete for market share in the tip market. They feel threatened. They compete in technology, both in the tip market and in new markets, in untipped markets or in new markets. Competition can be direct or can be indirect. There are discontinuities and tipping, and there is indirect entry into other markets. And I think there is a little gem a bit hidden in the book, which makes sense of all this, which is, I don't know which page it's exactly. Excuse me, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't keep track of the pages where things are quoted. But it's in the book, I'm sure of that. And it says, I think the most illuminating part of the book, to me at least, in understanding what these people do, is that Nicolas argues that these oligopolies put sensors that collect information. So one can think of Apple as a sensor company, Google certainly as a sensor company that likes to have sensors all over the place. Even Netflix has sensors because Netflix wants to censor what's your preferences for entertainment. Then they centrally process this information, and then they try to monetize that through the platform. And that can perfectly make sense of the fact that Netflix feels a threat from Apple, but Apple not quite feels threatened by Netflix, of course. So the book's argument again is there is an asymmetry, and I think let me say that this part of the book is very fruitful, and I'm sure I've learned a lot from the presentations today. I've learned a lot by reading reviews of the book, and I think the book is successful in creating a conversation in a field that was in need of such a structured conversation. Let me go to the second part of the book, which is antitrust. There is an asymmetry here. There are monopolies in tip markets, as insofar that these are firms that look pretty dominant in their markets. there is an oligopoly in tip markets. The analogy in the cover of the book is very telling. The trompo in Spanish with the chessboard. And then the book recommends in tip markets robust merger control against horizontal mergers against killer acquisitions, and in tip markets, untip markets, sorry, one should rely on competitive threats. I think this part of the book is a bit weaker. But I don't think that this is a shortcoming of the book. I think the book goes a long way in giving us a new way and probably a correct way of looking at these firms, which needs to be taken stock of, and we need to incorporate in the way we think when we think about antitrust. But again, the tools are not yet there, and so there is no good theory of harm here. It's very difficult to have harm with free goods. Of course, platforms charge to one side, they might not charge to another side of the platform, and the antitrust of this is complex. But it's very difficult to argue that consumers are being harmed by things that they get for free. Second, I would put some caution in the area. Why do we make so much fuss about two advertisers, Facebook and Google, a movie provider, Netflix, a retailer, Amazon, an upscale phone manufacturer, Apple, and a software company? I think in a way this is a bit overblown. These companies are very interesting because they seem to be all over the place, but once you get to the product or the service they produce, they tend to be very narrow focused, and they tend to be a very small fraction of the world economy. So what are the harms? Is the other side of the platform exploited, the side that doesn't get the goods for free? Does big tech expropriate their customers' information in some sense, and so they should pay for that? Or is there some exploitation on that side? Or are there new harms, privacy, fake news, and hate speech? I think the book is particularly compelling about new harms, about privacy, fake news, and hate speech. They have little to do with horizontal concentration. This is a feature of social media. This is not a feature of horizontal concentration. And so the tool, if society thinks that somebody needs to be regulated, the tool is regulation and not antitrust policy. And I think the book is very compelling about this. I think the book is a bit weaker about standard antitrust harms. I think it's not the responsibility of the book, though, because as said, I mean, the tools are yet not there. And lastly, I didn't quite get why antitrust should limit rents, how to do it, and what to do to get in, and what do you get in exchange? What is the harm again? What is the intervention you need to limit those rents? What will you get in exchange? What improvement in welfare will you get in exchange? I think antitrust has to provide answers to that, and maybe this is the topic for another book. As path-breaking as this book is on the analysis side of big tech firms. So summing up, we have much to learn about the economics of big tech. Big techs compete in many dimensions. That's, I think, a compelling point of the book. Antitrust has little as yet to say about big tech's new harms, and those should be treated by regulation and not by antitrust. And my conclusion about antitrust that I come out by reading this book is that we need a theory of harm to guide antitrust action. Thank you very much.
Nicolas, we have a couple of minutes, so you can react on Daniela's and Alex's comments.
Thanks a lot, Felipe. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to thank Daniela and Alex for the amazing common sense. You know, I've done many book presentations And I have to say that the level of dedication and investment in trying to understand what I wrote is top tier. So I'm very grateful for. I can see you've read my work and you've tried to make sense of it. So that's really moving. When you write something, you never really know what people, if people will like it, not like it, will they read it, will they understand it, and in a way also it's always very good because sometimes you try to express things and then people will read what you wrote, reformulate that in a way which is even more compelling. And I would be very curious to know if Daniela and Alex have notes of what they said, because they actually helped me improve my messaging. So if they can share that with me, that will be really great. I also note Alex's invite to write a second book, which means that we need to spend more time in Stanford together in the future. So that's great. And Daniela, I'll fly to Chile, or you'll fly to Florence, so we can have an additional exchange. So there's two. Okay, so I want to maybe do two things here. So Alex concluded we need a new theory. We need new theories of harm for antitrust to be deployed in these markets. If it has to be deployed, and in a way, I like this point. I totally agree. And I think when you think about a new theory of harm, formulating a new theories of harm requires careful diagnosis and measurements of harms before you build a theory, okay? And which means that, as Alex was saying, we need tools to understand the types, the magnitude, the frequency of the harms that we are talking about, right? So we don't have that. So before we build the theories of harm, we need social scientists to diagnose harms arising from the operation of these large tech firms at a scale at which they exist today. And I think if we start to look into harms, as Alex was saying, it's very difficult to have harms with free goods. If you had to do consumer surveys at a large scale, you'd be really, my intuition is you'd be really struggling to find harms. You'd have a hard time finding the typical harms that antitrust cares about, which means that the formulation of new theories of harm will be quite a journey and a challenge. Now, the way people have sort of treated that is, and that drives me to Daniela's points about data. So the ways people have sort of tried to think about these harms, trying to diagnose the harms, has essentially followed two distinct trajectories. So some people have said, so let's look at data. Data is a new thing, and there must be harm somewhere there. Okay, so and they've come up with all this thing about privacy and externalities and things of this kind. Or the other way that people have tried to, there's a route that people have tried to follow to diagnose harms, is to say, and I'm much less convinced by that. It's to say that there's harms, but people don't know about them, right? It's a sort of more paternalistic way to say, oh, you're doing something that you like, but it's really bad for you. Like, don't use, don't smoke, don't drink, don't run too much, don't watch TV too much, and that sort of stuff. And so I think this route is wrong to the extent that most of the products that these companies sell are not dangerous products like biological components and things of this kind, or smoke, or things with a sort of health or safety risk potential, right? As Alex was saying, you have a movie company, a software company. You have a retail company. So you set aside the political problems, which are not antitrust problems, really. I think this route of trying to sort of raise the concerns of people for the harms that they self-inflict to themselves by spending too much time online. I mean, this really is just very disputable. So I think the data thing is has more potential. And so Daniela has talked about data externalities. And so that's interesting. So if privacy is a problem, privacy is very poorly correlated to market power. So sorry, privacy losses are extremely poorly correlated to market power. There's very plausible reasons, and I think Daniela mentioned that, whereby increasing competition in these services will actually decrease privacy protection. And it's very hard to know if more competition is good for privacy or not. It's only good if you believe in a world where firms compete by product differentiation, by providing different sets of privacy policies, but it's not a given that this type of competition is the competition at play here. So I think what's the other thing that we don't understand well, which is more promising, is what you said about data externalities. And these are the sort of harms that you create on third parties by being very, the harms that one inflicts on others when one is being insufficiently protective of his or her own privacy. Okay, so so there's a paper by Acemoglu and others which talks about that and says, if a user discloses a lot of data, discloses a lot of information, which is then converted in data, then often this disclosure discloses data about other persons, right? And this is not really something that you account for when you disclose. So we need to understand more, and I think probably this is the way to go. This is the area where I would go. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. But that was so fruitful. I mean, it's just amazing. Thank you.
Alex, do you have any other question?
Yeah, there is one. Yeah, there are a couple of questions that came in the chat. One of them is Ricardo Paredes asks, what is the key non-replicable factor in the case of platform expertise? The point he's making is that a dominant position will come from asset that is not replicable. What is this in the case of platform expertise? Data on what can be done to replicate it, or is it a good thing that it's in the hands of only one participant?
I have to reply to that.
Yes.
Yeah. You're the guest.
Alex, I'm sure Alex and Daniela, I'm sure you can take a shot at that too. So I'd say the non-replicable assets is the user base, which at a certain point garners enough network effects that it's appropriated, it's exclusive to the firm, and this is what creates this sort of sticky demand conditions, and that's very hard to replicate. So at a certain level, the user base, becomes extremely large and creates a lot of, as Alex was saying, lots of the marginal benefits to users. So the economic benefits from being on the network are so high that it's very hard to go away. And this is, I think, the main source of the network effects is at the same time a source of large marginal benefits to users and stability in market share, in market position. Okay, and as Alex was saying, it's not clear which effects dominate the other in terms of the welfare consequences. So you can be mad because there's concentration, because this is the usual way we think about market share stability. But at the same time, you have to recognize that users derive substantial economic benefits from being on a network with a large number of other users, and to bring more grist to the mill of Alex's point, more benefits from being with many users, but also more benefits from benefiting from a set of applications which are complementary. So you like product integration. You like that everything's well synced and works well together. So I think that would be my reply.
Good. Alex, I think probably we are running out of time, so we just have time for the last question.
Okay. Another question that came from the audience. You put a lot of stress on tipping and the possibility that a dominant firm might be upset by a new entrant that achieves the tipping. And the question is, does tipping lead to a better product necessarily?
Okay, so that's a great point too. So, there's no evidence that tipping will always select the best outcome. So in many industries, we know that from history, there is a credible argument to make that when a market tips, it might tip to the less than optimal product or service. The number 2 and number 3. There's been a lot of talking about VHS, for instance, and Betamax and PAL-SECAM, and all these standards in recordings. And the question was, one standard prevails, and is this the best one? So you have the same set of questions with tipping. But I think there are two things which the conversation loses. There's a sort of, today in the convo, and you can see that actually in the DMA, there's a concern against tipping. So the policymakers do not like tipping. The default position is, tipping is more a bad thing than a good thing. And I believe this is wrong. There's many walks of life and areas in industry and policymaking in which we really try to promote tipping. Standard setting is an example. So you don't use the force of competition to tip the market. You use the force of cooperation with organizations like ETSI and ITU and IEEE, and you try to use cooperation to create a standard, in a way it's functionally analog to having a market that has tips. And why you do that, the reason you want to do that is you want to avoid fragmentation in the industry, which delays investments by producers and creates uncertainty. So tipping in a way removes fragmentation and reduces the window of uncertainty that delays investments by producers, manufacturers, and adopters of tech and developers of technology. So tipping is not a bad thing. It's neither a bad or a good thing. It has to be thought of as a phenomena that in certain circumstances might be not as good as you would have wished. And this is a classical case of you end up with a suboptimal solution. But then you enter into really hard questions because you'd have to prove, to be credible, you have to prove that you're not even in the second best world. You're in the third, fourth, or 10th best world. And so I'm just really worried when I read that people incriminate tipping almost per se and say we need to prevent tipping. There is efficiency to tipping.
Good. I think we have to stop here. Well, thank you very much, Nicolas and Daniela and Alex. I think it has been a very interesting discussion. And see you soon. I can give you the day, which it will be on July 15. And we will have a conversation on digital economy, antitrust, and Latin America. So it will be this one, that one, it will be in Spanish. So thank you very much. Take care and see you soon.
Thanks, Felipe.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Felipe. Bye
Thanks,
to
Felipe.
everyone.
Bye to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.